we have previously discussed that when we are fully present, time ceases to exist, and but in order to do our everyday tasks, we need to stick to the concept of time, and I'm trying to see where to achieve the balance, how much importance to give, and because obviously we see that nature sticks to a timeline. There are regular cycles, day, night, and seasons, and so on. And also in monasteries, they stick to a particular schedule every day. It's pretty strict, from what I've gathered. So it seems a little paradoxical to see these ideas on time.
So the problem here is you're confusing the relative and the absolute. So when you say when you're in presence, time ceases to exist, but otherwise we stick to a view of time. So it's important to understand, it's not that when you're present, time ceases to exist. Time never exists. It's a thought pattern. It never exists as an outer reality. It exists as a thought pattern. And when we think of time, we can say time exists, but it doesn't actually exist. We're just thinking of it, right? And so we don't actually need the idea of time to accomplish our tasks. Tasks just appear. Activity just appears. What we use time for is to communicate an understanding of the world to each other. An understanding of the world that's not accurate to what's actually happening, but it's a convention that we feel comfortable with. And it makes a mode of meaningful conversation. So when you say that nature is on a timeline, nature isn't on a timeline. We apply the thought of time to it. So, I'm suggesting these things, and language is inherently, to some degree follows reason and logic, and so it's dualistic. And so this language can't make it clear. Also, your intellectual mind can't fully grasp it. So you have to hear this as suggestive, as pointing to something beyond what our intellect can grasp. So in reality, there's the presence of whatever nature is doing. It's not on a timeline. It's just happening. But we bring in what it did an hour ago and what it did yesterday and what we expect it to do in an hour and what we expect it to do tomorrow. And then it appears to be on a timeline because of our thinking. So we can say from nature's point of view there's no timeline. But then we've made up a nature's point of view that doesn't exist. As far as we know, there's just consciousness. And that is nature. So the sun rising and the sun setting is simply our consciousness in activity. We make outside objects, we conceive of it as a thing outside us. And then we conceive of it being on a trajectory from previous things and toward future things. But that's just how we're conceiving of it. Wow, now we've got multiple leaf blowers. The bane of the quiet meditator's existence. There's a campaign to ban them in Portland, so I hope you all join. See what we can do. Little political interlude into the non-dual spiritual talk. So, what's relevant to one's spiritual path is when does the convention, the thinking convention of time, cause problems, and when is it just a means of communication and a means of organizing our thoughts? As a means of organizing thoughts and communicating, it's not inherently a problem. But when we look for happiness in time, we ignore the happiness that's present, and we never reach the happiness in time, because happiness in time doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. Only happiness in present actually exists. So as long as we look for happiness in time, we miss, to the extent we give that energy, we miss the happiness of presence. So when we think arranging conditions to create a future result will bring us happiness, that's what I mean by looking for happiness in time. When we do that, we turn away from the inherent nature of presence, which is happiness. And we instead look to our plan. And so that's what allows for suffering and discontent. So from the point of view of feeling freedom and contentment and joy, what's important is not looking for happiness in time. The more attention we give to the present, the more we can start appreciating its beauty or its happiness. And the more we're holding on to our idea of past and future is the extent that we're missing that. So that's why it's relevant. That's the balance. The more we let go of time-mind, the more we'll be able to appreciate true happiness and beauty. So if we're just picking up time-mind to communicate something and then going back to presence, it's not much of a problem. But if we're putting a lot of weight and stock and attention and emotional energy in time, to that extent we're distracted from appreciating the present. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's not like two realities. There's simply one reality that's free of time. Within that is a mind that makes time. Inherently, that's not a problem, but when we give that weight, we miss what's present.
So yeah, I see the way you explain it. I see the distinction, but it's not always that simple. Sometimes if I tell myself that I'm going to sit at 11 o'clock and then go to bed half an hour later, and before that I need to finish some tasks. Now that that there is this anxiety of whether can I finish it by then, and ironically I'm missing out on the present by aiming for that.
Right.
On the other hand, if I do not have that rule to myself, I could just work and not know that I have missed. I got. It's too late. I just have to go to sleep, for example. So when it comes to practice, I guess maybe my question is more geared towards the practical aspects of it. I understand the. I mean, yeah.
Ideally, just stay in presence. Then it doesn't matter if you miss your sitting because you've been sitting. Right? It's like if you sit in posture and think about the things you have to do tomorrow, it's not really sitting. But if you're doing some task but totally present with it, it's already sitting. So the reason we give ourselves discipline and give ourselves practice is because we're not being present, and when we do those practices, we find it's easier to return to presence. But really, we should just be being in presence as much as possible. Well, if you want to make a schedule for yourself because you find that allows more presence to be in your life, then that's good. But if you have anxiety about making the schedule and remembering the schedule and it takes you out of presence more, then it's not so good. Right? So, I mean, we can imagine a very natural kind of practice life where we get involved in some task, and because of our habitual associations with that task, it makes us think about past and future and miss the present. And then naturally we feel the intuition that I'm not being present, I have anxiety, I'm not free, and we just return to freedom and presence. I mean, it feels right. But if we find, like we're all addicted to certain activities that aren't truly joyful or aren't leading to freedom. So
start for some reason. This one start. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, I forgot to erase some stuff. Maybe we'll.
is it recording or no?
It's full. I should have erased the previous one. Sorry.
You know the cartoon Calvin and Hobbes? It's a funny one where Calvin just raised his hand and said, Miss Wormwood, I think her name was Miss Wormwood, can I be excused? My brain is full. So to help us from addictions, to have some kind of discipline might be good, but if we're getting so obsessed with our program to get us out of addiction that we get addicted to that, then it's not so helpful, right? So, you make a schedule for yourself. At 11 o'clock, I'm going to stop and sit, and then just try to be present in what you're doing, and at 11, stop and sit. If you keep thinking about it, try a different approach. Try as soon as you notice that you keep thinking about it to just stop and sit at least for a minute, something like that. And realize presence is presence. It doesn't matter if I'm in my sitting posture or sitting here at the table. One of my teachers once asked, what's the ideal period of time to sit? Because, some schools in Zen sit 40 minutes, some 30 minutes, some an hour, and then there's other schools outside of Zen that might sit all different times. He said 1 minute is best. By that, I think he really meant 1 second is best. Right now, returning to sitting is best. Not keeping track of the time. Just do it right now. And then just do it right now. And then just do it right now, you know? Because otherwise your mind makes time compartments of it. And to the extent you're thinking of time compartments, you're not present. It's the same with retreat. If you're going through like a 7-day retreat and you're really calculating, all right, day 1 down, 6 days to go. Day 2 down, 5 days to go. You know, you're just in time. The point is to let go. The point of retreat is you're not doing your other things, so you lose track of where you are and you're just present. To accomplish sesshin, or to accomplish one period of sitting, is an illusion. There's no accomplishment. You don't get anything.
How about
The second after sitting ends is just as important. Yeah. It's just a matter of being present and enjoying the beauty of presence and not being caught in time. That's all. Go ahead.
Sorry, how about the strict timekeeping in monasteries?
It's the same thing. It's there so people don't think about it. Like, you're not supposed to have a watch or something yourself, you know. Only the timekeeper, who's hopefully more mature in their practice so they don't get caught up in it, will use that. And it just makes it easy to coordinate. You know, it's to help pull people out of getting caught in their routine minds. Oh, it's time for sitting. Whatever you're doing, drop it and sit. Oh, sitting's over. It's time for walking. Walking's over. It's time for chanting. And you just follow one thing after another, and you're just present. It's to help you get out of time mind. And you know, it's generally more valuable for people newer to it. So in a lot of traditions, practitioners that have been doing it longer might do more private retreat or with a small group, and then there isn't a coordinated time. It doesn't matter. They just sit like a lot of the time until it's time to pee, until it's time to eat, you know. Peeing is a good example. It's like we don't worry so much about when it's time to pee. We just, I have to pee, I'll go pee, and then I come back and sit. We can do everything like that. Oh, I'm hungry, it's time to eat. This is a famous Zen phrase, when hungry, eat, when tired, sleep. That's the whole of the practice. It's only because we have these habitual minds and we're drawn into unwholesome practices that keep us obsessed with past and future and self and other, that we use some discipline to pull us out of that. But again, don't confuse the relative and absolute. So in the relative, in the monastery or any place where you're following a time discipline, in the relative, this thing starts at this time, this thing starts at that time. But in actual presence mind, that's not happening. There's just activity happening always. It doesn't matter how many people are looking at clocks and saying things, you know, at apparently certain times, but really it's always just presence unfolding. Exactly the same. So in the absolute sense, it doesn't matter how much people are thinking about time, there's still no time. And in a relative sense, even if someone's not in time, someone else who applies thinking, watches them from the outside and applies thinking, will say there's time. They've sat this long, you know, but to them they didn't sat that long. Life is just happening. And all this is the same with space too, which is, maybe we're a little less concerned with space, and maybe time is a little more important to question initially, but people get hung up about space too. I want to be in a different space. I want to be on the other side of the city, or the country, or the world. You know? But it's exactly the same. There is no other side of the country, or the city, or the room, or the world, or the universe. There is no other place. So we want to be in another time, and we want to be in another place. That's how time and space create suffering. I mean, time and space doesn't exist, but that's how our thinking creates suffering, through time and space. But if you realize there isn't another space, then you realize this space is completely fulfilling. Just like when you drop another time, this time becomes fulfilling. But in comparison to another time, this time becomes just a bunch of information, a bunch of attributes compared to the attributes of a future time. So you're actually missing what this time is. And same with space. The other space has certain attributes you just think of. They're just thought forms. And it's better than the thought forms that you're attributing to so-called this space. But there's only this space, ever. And it has an infinite variety of display. Our choice is only giving attention to this space, or giving attention to a fantasy space, which is also happening in this space, but it means we're dissatisfied because we're not realizing what there is. We're caught in a very limited thought form. This stuff is, it's challenging to your intellectual mind. And if you put up your intellectual mind against it, it will never become harmonious completely. But harmony can happen. It's a relaxation of the intellectual mind. But, you can use reason to get there, because our conventional understanding doesn't actually make sense. If you look up at the moon, I saw the moon this morning during sitting. It's quite beautiful. Did you all see the moon this morning? It's like a half moon. Conventionally, we say there's a certain distance, like there exists a distance between me and the moon. But where does that distance exist? What is distance? What is space? It's only in comparison, when you're thinking of the two objects, that you can conceive of the distance between them. There's no thing distance. There's also no thing moon. It's a completely different thing depending on your thought pattern about it. You could be very close to it, right? We've talked about this with the mountain, and it's just dirt, right? If it's a globe like that, we say the moon is a globe high in the sky. That's only because we're sitting here looking up at a certain conventionally speaking distance, and see the moon in a certain way. It's all our perspective. It's all our thinking. Of course, it's not our thinking. If it was our thinking, that would be confusing, because how did we make it all? It's thought arising, the universe arising thought in a particular body-mind at a particular time. Apparently, in a particular body-mind at a particular time. I mean, just using materialist science, we talked about this a little last week, I think there's ways to arrive at seeing materialist science doesn't make any sense. But just using materialist science as far as it goes, you can realize there's no moon, there's no anything. You just look at it closely enough and it ceases to have any attributes. And physicists who don't allow themselves to relax into that realization that there's only consciousness try to keep making some model. Every time the previous model doesn't work, they make another model that can temporarily work by thinking of it in a different way. And then people show how that doesn't really work either, so then they have to find another way, right? So string theory is thinking of, okay, inside the quark, inside the smallest thing, is these strings vibrating. What are the strings made of? Nothing. They're only two-dimensional, so they can't be made of anything. It doesn't make any sense. It's just to fill out the mathematical equation. It's predictive, but all we're doing when we're making predictive things is understanding the patterns of consciousness. Consciousness manifests in certain patterns. We know that. We can expect things and we can predict things. But that doesn't mean there's actually things. When you look carefully, there's no things. But what we do know is there's consciousness. I mean, if you attribute things to that, if you attribute a narrow meaning to that, then that's not true either. But consciousness as the totality of our awareness, experience as it's happening. So in practical matters, really, it's just a matter of recognizing the opportunity to return to presence, and recognizing that all anxiety and discomfort ceases when you're present. And then you just do it as much as you do it. The more you recognize that, the more you return to presence. The more you recognize anxiety and discontent and confusion in clinging to thought patterns, the less you'll cling to thought patterns. So when someone comes up to you and says, "What time do you want to meet later?" there's not really suffering about saying, "Let's meet at 3." If you start getting into like, "Oh, but if we meet at 3, then this, it won't be as good because this won't be as good, and then this, and then you get really worried about the time, then you're starting to miss your presence, right? And the longer you do that and the more you invest in it, the more you're missing your presence. So the balance is just recognizing that. In essence, the unfoldment of spiritual awareness is trusting more and more in everything being here and not making claims on some kind of objective reality, not inventing an objective reality out there. So when we see time, the appearance of time, meaning our memory of past and our imagining of future, is just a way our mind organizes reality. It's not the way reality is objectively existing. And same with space. We organize our movements through an idea of space, but it's not the way objective reality really is. So the more we release our claims about objective reality and our place in it, and the more we accept experience just unfolding, the more free we become. You realize my mind saying this is the way it is never correct. All that can be is my thought of this is the way it is, but not this is the way it is. This is the way it is can only be what actually is, just what's happening, not what you think about it. What you think about it is simply what you think about it. But that's delusion. That's kind of the definition of delusion. When we think, what we think about the world is how the world is. That's the delusion.
But sometimes it's not just about what we think. Because we live in a society, it's also what others think.
Well, what
because we are
others
part
think,
of the society.
yeah, but what others think is not going to cause our suffering.
True.
That's going to cause their suffering. So we have patterns of thought that we share as a society, of course. That's how we communicate and get along. But for everyone, to use that as a way to communicate and get along is okay, and to believe it's actually real is the degree that they'll suffer, whoever believes that. And of course, we're susceptible. We hear someone else's belief and we start to adapt it.
And we are also
So
forced to conform.
All bodies and minds are influencing each other. Well, they're essentially the same thing as well, but they're in the relative sense, we can say they're influencing each other. But it's not until you believe that you have the discontent occur. Just as a side note, Rupert Spira has a nice metaphor, maybe a little more than a metaphor, but a nice way of looking at how one consciousness can seemingly have separate contents. Why we don't know, if we're one consciousness, why don't I know what's in everyone else's mind?
Right.
And he's like, do you remember what you were thinking at 5:33 yesterday, exactly? No. Were you thinking of something? Probably, or experiencing something? Yeah, but you can't think of it. So time, it's very easy to say through time, even though that was you, it's gone now. So he says in the same way with space. Consciousness itself forgets, spatially, other things besides in this apparent body-mind. It doesn't actually forget, but this body-mind has that experience of forgetting. So you can see how the idea of ourself through time is just a fiction. We can't actually remember ourselves. We don't have access to it. We have certain memories that are just hanging there, and we put those together and construct this narrative. It's just constructed. But what's actually always happening is presence unfolding. And it's such a relief, such a relief. We don't have to keep track. We will remember things and we will future project, but we don't have to. It's not important. We don't have to hold. We don't have to think our happiness is going to be there. We don't have to think that's what we need for success. It's simply just a convention. It's just a language. And everything our heart actually wants is right here. In this one space, in this one time. Similarly, realizing your experience is simply the universe experiencing through this body and mind. The same universe experiencing through every body and mind is the only way we are relieved of loneliness. When we see that the sense of me as a separate being, as long as that exists, it doesn't matter how many people we have around us that say they love us and want to do things with us. It doesn't matter. As long as we have that, we're lonely to some degree. We can be distracted, but... And as soon as you realize the whole universe is just acting out through this body-mind, there's nothing to be lonely. The universe is also functioning through people we don't agree with. Objects we don't like and people we don't agree with. The Trump supporter, also the universe. Sorry. When we see those people we have opposition to as the universe, of course, there's no opposition there. They're not that other thing. They're just the universe. It's irrelevant whether they think that or not. That's just texture. But that's how real peace is realized. Or love. distinctions you think, you realize that's just my thinking. It's not objectively that way. There aren't actual distinctions. There aren't actual separations, differences.